very much. I'm supposed to be talking tonight about the Uyghur Tribunal, which I've chaired and which has recently given judgment to the effect that the People's Republic of China has committed offenses of torture, crimes against humanity, and genocide against the Uyghurs of northwest China, an enormous area, Xinjiang, and the Uyghurs are a Muslim ethnicity who have lived for a very long time in that part of the world. But in order to explain the tribunal and what it's done, I need to indulge in a few preliminaries, some of which won't seem appropriate, but you'll see where they go in the end. First, so far as the pupils and I are concerned, we both share an extraordinary privilege, in my case as in yours, of having an education better, probably better by far, than that of your parallel people of the same age. That sort of privilege lives with you for life, and you realize throughout that you have an advantage over other people that is in a sense not deserved. What should you do about that? Does it mean you owe a duty to put something back? I don't think so. I think we can all be as selfish as we like. But one thing about that privilege is that it means you can never complain about your misfortune so far as education is concerned, because the advantage survives. It may mean you can give something back. And it was interesting when we set this tribunal up, the circumstances of which have to be explained, but one of which is that everyone has to work completely without pay or any other kind of reward. And you know, the pool of people identified from whom we chose, in total 9, including myself and the other man who set this up, everyone, probably with similar educational privilege to that which you and I have, everyone was willing to work hundreds of hours unpaid on this project. Now that advantage or privilege can be seen in national terms. I'm not going to say Great Britain is the greatest nation on earth, because it probably isn't. There's no reason to believe it is. But it has real privileges. It hasn't been invaded, apart from a little episode by the Dutch sometime a couple of hundred years ago. It hasn't been invaded for 1,000 years. We've never had to pass through checkpoints at risk of somebody with a machete cutting off our arm, or starving to death, or being subject to sudden and immediate imprisonment without cause. That's a privilege. Does that mean that as people in this country we might be able to give something back? Maybe. The next thing that I think is quite important is to have a regard. They'll all come to be relevant a bit later. A regard to how societies like ours operate. Parliaments, governments, local governments, but other sectors. In particular, for example, the charity sector. Important, critically important and valuable in this country for centuries. And then something called NGOs, first named in that way in the 1945 United Nations Charter, but in fact existing to do the sorts of things that NGOs do for much longer than that. And NGOs, some of them huge, like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or Greenpeace, and some very small, local, try to do good in the world. And the thing about both the charitable sector and the NGO sector is that they nearly all have animate objectives, or objectives concerning humans or sometimes animals. And so you might say to yourself, he's going to tell us that the Uyghur Tribunal had as its object of interest and concern the Uyghurs. You'd be disappointed to know that's not the case. We would say to people, we on the tribunal, we don't have any particular concern about the Uyghurs, nothing over and above the concern we have for any people saying they're suffering oppression. So what were we doing? In order to understand that, I'm going to have to explain a little, before I come to the tribunal again, about the law. Because without that, what we were doing with this tribunal will not really make sense. Ordinary legal systems like the one we live in make sense. You've got a policeman, like the terrifying policeman who came to my house when I was less than 10 in Woodham Road, Bellingham, asked for me by name. I dropped a book with my name and address in it, and he brought it back. But ever since then, I've been terrified of the police. But that apart, we know about the legal system, policemen, endless television programs about courtroom dramas and everything. We understand it, it seems okay. And you may think, and I think one of my earlier encounters this afternoon showed this to be true, you may think that in the same way as domestic legal systems work, an international legal system works. Doesn't. It's barely there. It's in an infancy. It may die. It's necessary to understand where we are with the international legal system to think of one particular word: sovereignty. A word much used in the Brexit debate, probably leading people to think that the idea of a completely sealed country with borders within which you can do anything and nobody can get through those borders may have led people to think that's been around for thousands of years. Well, that's not true. It's quite a recent concept, sovereignty. But it did have a couple of centuries of, in Europe, sway, 17th and the 18th and 19th century. Because until the beginning of that time, both this country and Europe did not enjoy sovereignty. It was the Pope. It was the Holy Roman Empire. And it was only much later in those 2 centuries when we were busy in this country going out colonizing other people's territory that there was sovereignty. But it didn't last that long. Because in the last quarter of the 19th century, the 1870s, 60s, people started to say, hey, we've got to regulate the way we conduct ourselves in war. We can't just do what we like. So the American Civil War, there was a code on Lincoln's side. And in Europe, there were things called, first of all, the Geneva Convention, and then later conventions, Hague Conventions, dealing with prisoners of war, weapons that you could use, weapons that you could not use, how to treat prisoners, and so on. And so there were the beginnings then of control of the way states behaved by a code of law. You'll find it interesting if you dig around, sad in a way, to discover that at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, there was a great deal of optimism abroad, idealism, that there need never be more war, that everything could be dealt with by arbitration. Indeed, there was a palace built in The Hague in the Netherlands, started in 1899 and finished 1 year before the First World War, called the Peace Palace. It's there now, home to many international judicial and quasi-judicial judicial bodies. But all that optimism died, didn't it, with the First World War, a terrible, ghastly event. At the end of that war, there was some reckoning, well, maybe we should try people for doing bad things. And the treaty by which the First World War ended, Versailles Treaty, arranged to have the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, as it were, tried. But unfortunately, he hopped it to the Netherlands, and they gave him sanctuary. He was never tried. There were a few trials just of Germans in Leipzig, but nothing very serious. International activity did continue with something called the League of Nations, but it all died out with the rise of Hitler in Germany. And at the end of the Second World War, hey, war crimes trials. First in Nuremberg in Germany, and then in Tokyo for that part of the Second World War. Does this sound like good news? The world's waking up. We should go for law, not war. Has that idea of sovereignty, that you can't look at the inside of a country, been broken? Not quite. When the law that was applied for the trial of the Germans, it was agreed by Justice Jackson for the Americans and English, Russian, and French counterparts. And Justice Jackson, in framing, writing the law, made it quite clear, and the records are there, that the law they would apply for the ghastly things that happened in the Second World War, including the attempted annihilation of the European Jews, should not be such a law as would allow any intervention in America. He said in terms, we've done things that should not be subject of external consideration. What did he have in mind? May have been the historic attempted annihilation of the Native Americans. Do you know, and I'm sure this is politically incorrect in a way, as a boy, I used to go to next door for the television because we didn't have one for a long time. We used to watch films called cowboy and Indian films, where the white cowboys were the goodies, and you can guess who were the baddies. But the Americans may have been concerned about something else which is pretty horrible, and that is, until the 50s and even the 60s, in America, there were lynchings going on, mostly by then of black people by white people. Was that what Jackson had in mind when he said this law must not be allowed to penetrate that circle of sovereignty? I'm going to come back to that, because it's very important to understand where we are and where those of you who've got decades of life left will find yourself in those decades to come. At the same time, good things were happening. Most important, the 1948 Universal Declaration, or Declaration of Universal Human Rights, was drafted. Nearly every country signed up to it. They certainly wouldn't now. But they did then. And although it's not a legally enforceable code, it tells us how we should behave. And there was one other document that was signed up to by many countries, nearly all good, but very troublesome. And I'll tell you about it later. Because we must now go back to the First World War. One of the greatest massacres in the First World War was by the Turks of the Armenians. 1 million and more massacred or died on marches to the Syrian desert, forced marches, in an attempt to eliminate the Armenian people. Interesting example. At that time, the American ambassador Bergenthal to Istanbul wrote despairingly to the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, America's Secretary of State, saying, do something about this. And Lansing said, it's up to them. What they do in their borders, not our business. Just as Jackson was to say in the Second World War statute. And so 1 million people died, or more. In 1922, and this story is ultimately an inspiring story, because it shows what one individual can do to change the world. In 1922, a man called Sogam Stelerian encountered the arch criminal of the Armenian genocide, Taulat, who, although he was the sort of Grand Vizier, the Prime Minister, although he'd been tried in his absence in Istanbul and sentenced to death, was living free in Berlin. And Stelerian went up to him with a gun and shot him dead. Waited to be arrested, was tried, and I'm happy to say, acquitted, because that man, that youngish man, had seen his father and his sister and his brother butchered on those marches by which the Armenians were so seriously, partially destroyed. But that's not the man I want you to be inspired by. We moved to Lviv in Poland, and a young law student, so as some of you may be before not too long, read about this trial and was puzzled as to how such terrible things could happen, how there couldn't be laws to stop this thing. And he said to his tutor, what about this? Can't we stop this sort of thing where people do these things? And his tutor said, it's like the farmer looking over the fence. If his neighbor chooses to wring the necks of the entire flock of chickens that he has, that's his business. And if you involve yourself, it's trespass. The young man wasn't persuaded. He became troubled by this problem. He had solutions to it. He worried everybody under the sun. He's probably became what would have been called a geek or something in modern terminology. But life was not going to be good to him because he was Jewish. And when the Second World War came, all of his family, I think something like 41, bar one brother, extended family, all perished in the Holocaust. He survived. But his idea was still in his head. And he went to Nuremberg with his idea and with a new word. He would have liked that word then and there to be a law, but it was applied by the prosecutors in Nuremberg as a term of description. But this man, now not so young, knew that the statute, the law that Jackson had imposed would never in itself save a further attempted annihilation of Armenians or Jews, because it had been framed in this very cautious way to save America or other countries from being supervised by law from outside. And so this man, Raphael Lemkin, went to New York, the newly formed United Nations, and single-handedly had turned into a form of law genocide. He had the Genocide Convention created almost on his own. And it's that convention which sets out obligations between states not to commit genocide that has led to the law of genocide in various other statutes and other places. And can you think of many men who single-handedly have added to the lexicons, the dictionaries of all who are educated, a word of such importance? No. He died not that long afterwards. There weren't very many people at his graveside. So, what do we see? This concept of sovereignty, the sealed state, alive in Lansing when he didn't try to save the Armenians, in Jackson when he cast the law, with the Brits, of course, in support, for the Second World War. And what came next? Well, what came next was a slow increase in the supervision of war by law. There were some ad hoc, some one-off trials created for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda in 93 and 94, and I worked in one of those courts. Later, there was the International Criminal Court, created in 98. Permanent, we hope so, but you can't be sure. Republicans in America would like to see it destroyed. Trump said as much in 2018. So did his then security advisor, a man called Bolton. And in any event, that court only covers a portion of the earth. For the rest, there is no supervision of war by law. Now, I said not so very long ago that this convention was mostly good, or very nearly all good, not quite, or depending on your view, not quite. Here it is. The convention to which various countries committed themselves, including our country, but only reluctantly after some decades, has as Article 1 the following. The contracting parties, that is, countries who ratified or acceded to the convention, the contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law, good start, which they undertake to prevent and to punish. That article is of immense importance. It has been interpreted by that court I told you about, the top court in The Hague, as meaning the duty to act is the minute you know that genocide is happening or is likely to happen. So any country that says, that country is committing genocide, has a duty there and then to act. Well, what do you think's been the reaction of countries to that in the 70 years since? How many times do you think countries have said, our obligation under Article 1 of this convention has been triggered? How many? 5, 10, 15, 20? None? None. Countries will indeed go to almost any lengths to avoid recognizing a duty to react to or to follow their undertaking. Our own country spent an enormous amount of time in the last 2 years on something called a trade bill, ensuring, and it only just managed to succeed, that it could defeat an amendment to the trade bill in Parliament that said you mustn't form a trade agreement with a genocidal country. It only just defeated it by the most heavy-handed of methods in Parliament. And it defeated it because it has the following wonderful protocol logic. It says only a judge can decide whether genocide has happened. But it said that, knowing that there's no judge anywhere who can be activated to find out whether genocide has happened. Ergo, thus, the United Kingdom will never have to respond to its undertaking under Article 1. Isn't that clever? So let me now come to the Uyghur Tribunal. And I'll come back to some of those things we discussed or I raised right at the beginning. The Uyghur Tribunal came about because an interested group, the World Uyghur Congress, asked me and another chap to set up a People's Tribunal. We haven't discussed People's Tribunals earlier today. I can if we have time in the question and answer session, but never mind. There are lots of them, they do different things, but they are, as the title suggests, tribunals of people. We agreed to set one up on certain terms. First, we would of course be completely independent of the commissioning NGO as it was. And they understood that. We might not bring in the result they wanted. Second, everyone would be unpaid, and indeed not able to put any money into the tribunal, so that their independence was, from first to last, guaranteed. Next, we started with a blank sheet of paper, no presumptions. We had a mass of evidence prepared. We ensured that a fair representation of the evidence, including evidence favorable to the People's Republic of China, was presented to us all in public, nothing in private. We had 2 evidence sessions in Church House, Westminster, and we had 1 other session online, all in public. We drew no inferences adverse to China from the fact that although we invited them to join in, they didn't. We then applied the strictest possible test to the evidence, both factually, proof beyond reasonable doubt. The test that's used in a criminal case if you're trying someone for murder, theft, burglary, whatever you like. The law is not very clear because there haven't been many genocide cases, so we applied only the clear and certain law, nothing else. Interestingly enough, amongst the people who presented evidence to us, 1 or 2 of the lawyers would have liked us to have been softer on ourselves and to have been more expansive in the conclusions we could reach about the PRC, the People's Republic of China. We said, no, thanks very much. If we're going to do this as 9 citizens concerning the most powerful, or probably the most powerful, certainly the most numerous state on earth, they're entitled to the highest standards, and we will apply them. And it was as a result of that, with evidence, unsettling, disquieting evidence of mass arrests, mass detention, mass torture, forced control of birth by various methods, that we reached the conclusions that we did. And the genocide conclusion being the very limited one of interfering with the birth. Because if you stop the births of a particular ethnicity, you reduce the size of its population. And that can, as we found, be genocide. And then what did we do? Nothing. We did nothing intentionally. What normally happens with the report of a charity or an NGO or even a parliamentary committee is at the end of their findings there's then about 2 or 3 pages of recommendations to all and sundry what they should do. First of all, nobody ever reads that. Secondly, by the time you got through to reading it, you've forgotten what the conclusion was. And third, it's a bit of a cheek, isn't it? To go around telling governments and schools and universities, for example, in this case, don't invest in China, or don't have, sticking with the educational sector, don't have an outpost in China, don't take Chinese money, for example. What a cheek. No. We said, once you've got a conclusion, properly argued, fully in public, every bit of material available, there it is. Everyone has responsibilities. And the assumption must be that provided with that conclusion, you will act in accordance with your national, international, human rights, or whatever it is, duties. That's what we did. That's why, you see, as I explained at the beginning, we didn't make the Uyghurs our interest. Our interest was to help the community around us, including governments, but all sorts of other people who interact with the People's Republic of China. We made it our job to provide them with something that could help them. And interestingly enough, it does seem to work. Its modesty, its caution, its conservative approach does seem to work. More and more bodies come to us for explanation, the European Parliament, French Assembly. Other bodies are just taking the judgment because it is small in a sense. It's not over-ambitious. And yesterday, the British Medical Association, just on the basis of the judgment, made very serious pronouncements about the conduct of medicine because it becomes involved in the various horrible things that happened in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs. They've made a statement about it. They've discharged their responsibility. And so that is what the Uyghur Tribunal was and is. And for those of you who have decades more ahead of you, it's worth perhaps thinking of your privilege, of your good fortune, of the advantages you have over the rest of the world or over other people. And if you decide to go into the law or into politics or anything else, or if you just decide to be an ordinary human being like the rest of us, citizen like the rest of us, to think of what you can do to nudge the world to behave better. It's very easy, as some lawyers have done, to prepare opinions, make them public, say the most terrible and damning things about the People's Republic of China. We didn't do that. We respected China. It's a huge country. It has to educate its people, feed its people, build roads for its people. Does all of that. And if it's done something wrong that is contrary to the rights of man, then we can tell them. We can encourage them to change. And if our country is failing to do what it should do under the Genocide Convention or otherwise, we can offer them this piece of information, this judgment on which to act. So, Headmaster, I might end there, because if there are questions, they can come. If there are not, everyone can go home. Yes, okay, I will. Yeah.
Hi. I thank you very much for the opportunity. I've turned out today because I've been following this topic.
Mm-hmm.
Great interest of mine. And I've watched the tribunal online, and I've also watched your verdict at the end, 25 minutes long. I watched it twice. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And I couldn't resist but to basically take this opportunity to challenge you a little bit.
Go on.
Don't mind?
No, I don't mind at all.
Right. Because it's a topic of my interest, I have been doing a little bit of research and looking into it a little bit. And the other side of the story, I would say, is the reason why they didn't respond or take part. They said they were questioning the legitimacy of the tribunal, and there's one thing, like my findings, so I would like to hear
I'm going to have to repeat this question for the tape, and I'm not going to be able to. And that's okay, don't worry. I'm going to summarize it so far. You're saying that China has said that the witnesses are suspect because of their collateral interest in asylum, and some of them come from yes, some of them come from terrorist organizations. And your last point, because I think I must answer you. Yes.
Okay, so there are individuals that needs to tell a story to get the asylum, or they are individuals from organizations that are actually funded by state-funded NED or the U.S. Congress itself, like HSNs. So how is this fair?
All right, well then, thank you. How is it fair and the witnesses are funded by hostile countries and organizations? First of all, and I said we didn't hold it against China that they didn't take part, but although they made some of these complaints in a very generalized way, they made none of them in a detailed way. Some witnesses called were the subject of public complaint about what they'd done. Wherever that happened, we investigated that with the witnesses concerned. But again, very little detail was ever provided by the PRC. So far as witnesses having parallel objectives or collateral objectives, asylum and so on, we were very aware of that. And if we had the suspicion that any potential witness might have been using the process in order to gain advantage, we excluded the witness. We also excluded any witness, for example, against whom, although they hadn't provided it, it was possible to guess that the PRC might have had positive objections. There was one, an insider, as they're called, a policeman, who gave very graphic evidence. But he gave different accounts to different television companies. He might well have been just simply remembering more. He might have been traumatized and therefore suffering from change of memory. But we said no. If there's a risk that he might be attacked in a full forensic setting, we discarded his evidence altogether, as the judgment that you heard made clear. As to all the other witnesses, there are various ways in which you can, in the modern terminology, triangulate the evidence. If you have a witness in this part of Xinjiang saying something very similar to a witness from here and from here, and there's no connection between the three of them, you start the process of being able to say, well, this is beginning to look like policy at work. If you find that there's further evidence from other sources also matching evidence similar in factual content, that helps you again. Then there were many documents that were leaked, ultimately a very, very important set of top secret documents from President Xi himself, such documents never having been leaked in full before, leaked specifically to our tribunal, tested and explored by academics as to whether they were reliable, which fitted in policy terms with the evidence that was being given. And then there were documents, other documents as well. Finally, we did that which humans do all the time. When you listen to someone else, you assess whether you accept what they say completely or in part, and you act on that basis. We were, as I've said, completely strict, proof beyond reasonable doubt, and if we had doubt, or even the scintilla, the weakest possible amount of doubt, the evidence was discarded. Thank you for your detailed observations. I'm bound to say that if the PRC had had your courtesy and presented evidence of a detailed nature, it would have been a great assistance because it could have been forensically explored. But thank you.
My question is twofold on how one should act as a global citizen. The first one being, especially with China, more in general, but
question, I've got to repeat it, remember? Yeah, that's all right.
So basically, should we as global citizens, should we boycott companies like Apple that are in that area? Should we boycott places that make clothes and things like that? But that would lower our quality of life. Because I know that NGOs never say that that those factories shouldn't be open. They always try and encourage it, even if they're bad, because they provide work. And the other part of my question is a Turkish, it's not state-owned, but essentially state-owned newspaper company has just come out with something on the Armenian genocide, blaming the Jews on it. Now, I am Jewish, so this sort of became quite a bit of me. And with the banning of mouse in places like Tennessee, how do I convince people, how do I explore the options of things that are producible but we're being blamed?
Gosh, what a lot of questions. Well, the first question is, what's the duty of the global citizen not the global citizen, the citizen of the world, if goods are being made in circumstances associated with criminal acts, slave labor, for example, when if you actually were to boycott them successfully, you might close the factories down. Is that about right? Yeah. Okay. I'll come to the second question in a second, because I can't answer it. But this one I can answer, in that I'm not going to answer it. You understand, I'm not an activist. Not at all. And I'm not going to tell people what to do. But the question has a really important core to it. The citizen does have the capacity to discharge the duty we owe to all other citizens. Because, in my view, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights tells us that your right is my duty, my right is your duty, wherever you are. So yes, the citizen has a right. And it is the first stage in the duty is to ensure that you know the facts. That's what we've done. Whether you then make an individual decision about boycotting goods, whether you make a decision about what you ask your MP to do, what you ask your government to do, is a matter for you. It is not a matter for me. That's why, I repeat, our contained, modest, cautious approach may be one that serves the public interest, because it says to all of you, if you've got a duty that you recognize, here's some information, get on with it. And without going too far, with one of the groups earlier this afternoon, when we were talking about distance, does it matter? It's the other side of the globe. And the answer may be to ask yourself a what if. What if this, we've got, as I told the group, we've got how many near neighbours? The Netherlands, Belgium, France, Spain, and the Republic of Ireland. Those are our neighbours. What if these terrible things were happening in one of those countries, so that you couldn't blind yourself by distance? Would you then say you had a duty to act? And if so, what was the duty? And that's, I'm afraid, the only answer I can give you to the first question. To the second one about Armenia and allegations of the kind you make, I can't help. Yeah, but I can't help resolve that. Again, you're asking of me more than I have specifically said I'm prepared to do. And I often tell people, a people's tribunal of the kind I've created is like a jury. What happens in a criminal trial? Jury comes in, knows nothing, gets presented with evidence, told what the law is, we did the same, reaches its verdict and goes home. And its verdict is then for others to deal with, the judge, probation, prison service, whoever else it might be. And I'm afraid I'm going to stick to that narrow last. Now, who had their hands up first? Sir, I think you did.
Quick question. Having travelled extensively in Kosovo and Bosnia for the last 20 years, why should I have any confidence in the pain that people there are still going through today? The situation in China is going to be any different another 25 years down the line?
I think the first part of your question was that Bosnia and Kosovo are not advanced. Is that right?
They haven't really advanced.
No, quite right.
People are suffering there.
Yes, quite right.
Family members that still haven't turned up is going on today.
So, and therefore, why bother with China? Because it could be the same. Well, first of all, as to the observations about Bosnia and Kosovo, interesting and pertinent so far as I'm concerned, because I have remained, to some extent, involved with Bosnia, and I was in Sarajevo last week. And the problem with Bosnia, for those of you who don't know it, about it, and no reason why you should, it's comprised of three parts, really. Two parts, or one part then further subdivided. Bosnian Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, in a segment of Bosnia they've carved out, and Catholic Croats. And at the settlement of the Bosnian War in the end of 1995, a ridiculous constitution was imposed on the country that is incapable of being operated. Now, I'm going to expand a little bit on the answer because the gentleman raises a very interesting question. It's arguable, as a minimum, that one of the reasons there's the mess there is in Bosnia is because the Western powers never wanted a Muslim state in the heart of Europe. There's quite a lot of evidence to support that. There's also quite a lot of evidence now to support the suggestion that the worst massacre in Bosnia, in Srebrenica, in July 1995, was, to a degree, colluded in advance by the West, who made a purposeful decision not to save it, knowing what the outcome could be. And what's a sad reality is the last 25 years have developed is that Bosnia has not been able to write its own history. And here's one of the reasons why. And let me tell you, I know nothing about football. But in a long article I wrote for a Bosnian paper that came out in a couple of parts over a couple of weekends ago, I said, look, in a football match, you can have yellow cards, you can have red cards, you can have the skipper of this side sent off. But in the end, if this team wins, that's all that ultimately counts. Now, one of the shortcomings of the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, that only one side was tried, the Germans and the Japanese, led ultimately, a bit later, to the complaint that this was something called victor's justice. And everybody thinks victor's justice is a bad thing, and you ought to try people on all sides. And that's what's happened at the Yugoslav tribunal. But what they're looking at is not the match result. They're looking at the yellow cards and the red cards. And that has enabled the Serbs to say, actually, well, we did a little foul, but they did a foul as well. And really, it's all even Stevens. When it isn't. Bosnia is the holy, Bosnian Muslims are the wholly innocent victims. And they should have been pronounced as such by all Western powers. And they should have been accorded the respect that being the complete victim, the winner ethically or morally of the match, should have afforded to them. And that has not happened. Is 25 years enough to give up? Do we allow the Serbs in Bosnia to go off and join Serbia itself? Perhaps not yet. And so I have a plan, and I think we must keep trying. And the first thing we must do is get the West to admit that it's been hostile to Bosnia and that it must recognize that Bosnia is the victim. It's the match winner. Headmaster, it looks as though you've had enough of me.
I'm conscious
Oh, don't worry about my time.
I'm also conscious that Sir Geoffrey will stay behind. I'm sure he won't mind staying behind. I'm just saying he won't mind staying
No,
behind.
not at all.
And talk to people individually as well afterwards. But maybe just time for one more question.
The lady at the back has been
Yes.
hoping to get her question in.
So something that you mentioned earlier was that in the UK they wrangled it so that a judge is the best person to decide whether genocide has occurred, and then whether the UK should respond to the genocide.
Can't hear you terribly well. Either speak up or I'll come closer.
Right, so you mentioned earlier that in the UK a judge has to decide whether genocide has occurred, or
Yeah.
whether that then incurs the UK's obligation to respond to
Yeah.
genocide. Who, if not a judge, is in the best place to figure out whether a genocide has happened? That's my first question. My second question is, what should we then do? If a tribunal has happened in this case and there is still a genocide occurring, if UN peacekeeping forces went into Yugoslavia and we still feel the repercussions of that today, what should we do to respond to genocide in a way that is effective? That's the first one.
It's not a short question, Headmaster, but I'll do my best. So, if it doesn't work, what should we do? Oh, sorry, who's the best person to decide? In my reckoning is that the Genocide Convention really required the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister of the day sitting at his desk to do the exercise that we have now done for him. So if you ask who's the best person to do it, it's either the government or it's somebody like us, if there's no judge. And without praising ourselves, because I'm not going to, and I had 8 colleagues and we're all equals, a group of citizens, none of us had special interests in China, none of us were especially sympathetic for the Uyghurs. They were high-level people, most of them, 5 professors from different disciplines and 4 others. So they're highly qualified people. But that sort of gathering of people, if you approach the problem on an evidence basis, is as good as any other. But it should be the Foreign Secretary, and she, or before her, he, should have dealt with this. And then it would never have been necessary for us. We said if anybody else was doing this job, thanks very much, we would have spent our time on other things. The second part of your question, what do you do if the UN goes in and it doesn't work? You try again. We have no choice in a dangerous world to say, oh, that didn't work, so I'll give up. You have to try. And those of you with decades ahead will face all sorts of horrors not known to me, never to be known to me. And if you're in politics or the law, or if you're a citizen of concern, you'll decide what your duty to your fellow citizen requires of you. Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't come to your question, but you can ask me later.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey, for giving up your time to talk to us tonight. I'm sure I can speak for us all in saying how interesting and thought-provoking we found it. I, for one, was very interested in your comments about NGOs. As a token of our appreciation, we've got a little St Dunstan's goodie bag here for you.
Ooh,
yeah, very exciting. And can I please ask you all to join me in one more round of applause for Sir Geoffrey?